If you think the most terrifying creatures on Kael live beneath the sand, then you've never looked into the eyes of a child realizing he's not human. The wind howled like a living thing, screaming across the dunes with a voice that peeled layers off the rock and skin alike. It wasn't just a storm. It was a black storm. Rare. Charged. Lethal. The kind that turned men mad and machines blind. In this part of the Kael wastes, there were no shelters, no settlements, no rescue, only Kael, his cave, and the silence he'd nurtured for years. Until now. He spotted them through the shifting veil of grit and static, two figures staggering in the storm. One tall, barely upright, the other small and clutching her hand. A woman and a child. Out here? Impossible. Or suicidal. Or both. And behind them, like a shadow coiling beneath the sand, came something far worse, the telltale ripples of a thorax, ancient predator of the deep dunes, hunting by vibration, its massive maw waiting just underfoot. Kael didn't move at first. He should have let it happen. The rules were clear: survive, stay unseen, trust nothing. But then the wind shifted, and the boy turned his head. Their eyes locked through the storm, even at a distance. And something in that child's gaze made Kael move. He launched from the rocks like a shot, skidding down a sloped ridge, cutting across the sand with the practiced precision of someone who knew the terrain like breath. He reached the pair just as the first tremor hit the warning quake of the thorax rising. "Run," Kael growled, his voice lost in the storm but his meaning clear. The woman hesitated, eyes wide with exhaustion and disbelief. "Go." She stumbled forward, dragging the boy with her. Kael dropped a sonic flare behind them, a tiny device no larger than a stone, but its pulse vibrated through the sand like a wounded beast. The thorax turned its attention, breaching with a scream that split the wind, a mountainous eruption of teeth and tentacles. Kael ducked behind a rock outcropping, pulling the woman and boy down with him as the flare detonated. The explosion was blinding, a burst of light and pressure that stunned even the creature. But it wasn't enough. The thorax roared, swinging its tentacles wildly, seeking prey. Kael pulled a blade from his belt, an old, scorched plasma edge, and lunged out from cover, slashing at a reaching limb. Sparks flew. Acid blood hissed as it hit the sand. The thorax screamed and reared. And then, it stopped. Frozen. Its massive head turned. One lidless, alien eye fixed on the boy. Kael, panting, bleeding, paused mid-stance. He looked between the monster and the child, who now stood fully exposed in the open, unmoving, gazing back at the thorax with something far too calm for a 9-year-old. The creature shuddered. Slowly, like a mountain lowering its shoulders, it sank back into the sand without another sound. Vanished. Silence returned. Kael didn't move for a full 10 seconds. Then he sheathed his blade, turned to the woman. She was shaking. "What the hell was that?" he asked. She opened her mouth, closed it, and finally said, "We need shelter. Now." Kael nodded once. He led them through the last stretch of dunes toward a narrow canyon that twisted into shadow. His cave was buried beneath layers of rock and tech scramblers, undetectable unless you knew where to feel. As they climbed down, the boy looked at Kael, head tilted. "You're not afraid," the boy said. "Should I be?" "Most are." Kael didn't reply. Inside the cave, away from the static and death howls of the storm, Kael lit a small thermal lamp and tossed a thermal blanket toward them. The woman took it, wrapped it around the boy. He didn't seem cold. "Just watching," Kael said by a panel of broken equipment, pretending to busy his hands while keeping one eye on the strangers. The woman caught her breath. Her face was gaunt but not unkind. Scars lined her temple, implants removed, maybe. A past erased. "What's your name?" Kael asked. "Erin." "This is Rilo." Rilo. The name didn't feel strange. It felt familiar, in a way Kael didn't like. "And what the hell were you doing in the middle of a black storm?" Erin looked at the child before answering. "We were running." "From what?" "Everything." Kael didn't push. Not yet. But something was wrong. The boy. The way the creature reacted. The way the sand seemed to hum when he walked. Kael had spent years learning every sound, every signal of this world, and this boy didn't fit any of them. Later that night, while Erin slept lightly and Kael kept watch, Rilo came to sit beside him. "You've seen them before, haven't you?" the boy asked. "Seen what?" "The things under the sand." Kael didn't answer. Rilo nodded, as if he already knew. "They listen. But they don't like listening to me." "Not yet." The boy looked out into the dark, beyond the cave's mouth, where the storm still raged. "They will, though," he whispered. "Soon." And Kael, for the first time in years, felt something he thought he'd buried: fear. The storm had died, but the desert never truly went silent. The sands whispered in the windless dusk, hissing secrets to no one and everyone. Inside Kael's cave, shadows clung to the edges of stone walls, and silence settled like dust. Kael stood near the entrance, one eye on the darkness outside, the other on the two strangers he'd brought into his sanctuary. The woman Erin was tending to the fire lamp, feeding it slow-burning fuel strips. Her movements were precise, almost clinical, the kind of efficiency he'd seen in tech engineers, not fugitives. Her son, Rilo, sat beside the flames, cross-legged and still. Too still. He watched Kael the way a scholar might study an artifact, quietly, curiously, and with the kind of patience no child should possess. "You've lived here long?" Rilo asked suddenly. Kael raised an eyebrow. The boy's voice was calm, deliberate, as if he were reading lines from a script. Not a trace of the panic he'd shown earlier. If anything, it sounded rehearsed. "Long enough," Kael replied, keeping his tone neutral. Rilo nodded as if Kael had confirmed a theory. "Then you've seen the storms. The real ones. The ones that don't come from weather." Kael didn't answer. "Not directly. I've seen what this world hides." Erin looked up at that. Her face betrayed nothing, but her hands paused just briefly on the fuel strip. Then continued. Later, after the cave grew warmer and the outer wind settled into background hums, Erin sat across from Kael while Rilo dozed by the fire. "You saved us," she said. "Thank you." Kael grunted. "Didn't do it for thanks." "Still," she pressed, "we owe you." Kael narrowed his eyes. "You running from Varnoke?" "Why?" She hesitated. Not in fear. Kael could spot fear. This was something else. Calculation. Measuring how much truth to release. "I used to work for them," she said finally. "Not by choice. I was part of a research division biotech integration. We were stationed near one of the old crash zones. Old tech. Older than old. Pre-drift era. Stuff that shouldn't even exist anymore. We were meant to study it. Harvest it. Use it. But we didn't understand it." Kael listened in silence. "When we found what we did," Erin continued, "they decided we were expendable. I ran. Took what I could. Took him. Kael glanced at the boy. Rilo hadn't stirred. He's your son. Yes. And what is he? Erin didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked to Rilo, then back to Kael. Her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. He's mine. That's all that matters. Kael didn't press, but the weight in the air grew heavier. Something was missing in her story. Something vital. That night, Kael couldn't sleep. He paced the outer ledge of his cave, eyes trained on the dunes below. He thought he saw movement more than once, a shimmer, a flicker in the distance. Watching. Waiting. A presence. He wasn't paranoid. Not anymore. Life on Kael had taught him that if you felt watched, you probably were. Inside, Erin moved carefully. She thought Kael was asleep. She pulled a small, black case from beneath her pack and opened it under the dim flicker of the firelight. From it, she removed a device compact, angular, covered in alien inscriptions. It pulsed faintly. She assembled it quickly, attaching modular pieces with magnetic clicks, her hands swift and practiced. When it came alive, the glow was faint but unmistakable, a soft azure flicker, hovering slightly above the device. She whispered. Not in basic. Something older. Forgotten. The glow pulsed in rhythm with her voice. Kael had returned silently, unnoticed. He watched from the shadows, saw the interaction but not the meaning. The language scraped at something buried in his mind, like dust stirring against sealed memory. The device flickered, and a distorted voice answered back. AI, or something like it. Not synthetic in the usual sense. More biological. Kael stepped back without a sound. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he scanned the horizon again. That shimmer was closer now. Whoever or whatever it was, it had followed the same trail Erin had. He glanced at Rilo, who now lay in sleep but twitched subtly, like someone dreaming something far too heavy for a child. Kael's hand moved to his weapon. It wasn't just the Varnoke who were after them. Something else was hunting. And Kael didn't like the idea that he might be part of whatever game had just begun. The sun rose over the Kael wastes in hues of copper and blood, casting jagged shadows across dunes that looked more like scars than land. Kael led the way, his boots sinking with each step as the sand shifted beneath them. Behind him, Erin followed with her usual silence, while Rilo walked calmly, almost eerily, as if the desert knew to make way for him. Their destination loomed ahead, a great depression in the sand, wider than any crater caused by impact. The locals, before they disappeared or were taken, had called it the Silent Mouth. It was once a research site, Erin had said, a forgotten hub buried by time and sand. Kael didn't remember it, not clearly. But something in his spine prickled with every step closer. When they reached the edge, the wind shifted. The air turned sharp. Kael stopped and narrowed his eyes. The pit below wasn't natural. Smooth stone, cut with precision and etched with glyphs, formed a ring around its perimeter. Machines lay half-buried, long dead, and coated with rust and sand. But the symbols on the walls, they glowed faintly. "We're here," Erin said, stepping beside him. Kael didn't answer. His hand grazed one of the stone panels, and a shock lanced up his arm. Vision blurred. The desert spun. Then came the pain. A sharp, splitting migraine, as if his brain was being scraped from the inside. He staggered back, clenching his jaw to avoid crying out. Flashes. Lights. Needles. Voices. Restraints. He saw a room, cold and sterile. He saw himself younger, weaker, screaming as something was done to him. Kael. Erin's voice dragged him back. He collapsed to one knee, breathing hard. What the hell was that? He managed. Erin didn't answer. But her face was pale, and her eyes lingered too long on the glyph he'd touched. Rilo stepped forward without a word. As if drawn, he approached the edge of the pit and placed his palm on a central pillar, one mostly buried, but still intact. The glyphs along the structure flared to life, bright blue and humming with restrained energy. Rilo, wait, Erin began. Too late. The ground beneath them trembled. Sand flowed away like water as ancient mechanisms roared to life below. A massive circular panel in the center of the depression split, slowly rotating open to reveal a spiral ramp leading downward into darkness. Kael stood, still shaken, but eyes now locked on the entrance. That wasn't supposed to happen, was it? Erin shook her head. Only the authorized were ever able to access the inner levels. The system rejected almost everyone. Sometimes violently. And he just walked in, Kael muttered, looking at Rilo. He's not walking. He's being welcomed, Erin said, voice hushed. They descended into the depths, the ramp lit by glowing veins in the walls. The air grew colder, thinner, laced with an ancient sterility that reminded Kael of something between a temple and a lab. At the bottom, they reached a large chamber with towering columns and walls covered in alien writing. Kael turned slowly, taking it in, and froze. A mirror-like panel pulsed in the wall across from him. As he approached, the panel shimmered and activated, revealing holographic projections, files, diagrams, medical records. His name. His face. Subject 11, the label read. Kael's heart hammered. He reached out instinctively, and the panel reacted. More data unfurled, notes on physical enhancement, neural alteration, memory suppression. I've been here before, he whispered. Erin didn't speak, but he saw her expression shift, a quiet confirmation. Why didn't you tell me? I wasn't sure you'd remember, she said. They made you forget everything. I wasn't even certain it was you, not until you touched that glyph. Kael's hands clenched. The images swam before him, too many details to process, too much truth too fast. They used this place to turn people into weapons, he said. Into things. Erin's voice was soft. They tried. Most didn't survive. You did. Rilo stood near another console, watching a set of rotating blueprints scroll past. He didn't touch them. They responded to his presence anyway. What is this place? Kael asked. A vault, Erin said. And a forge. A place where minds were cracked open and rebuilt. Some came here seeking salvation. Others were brought against their will. Like you. Kael looked at his reflection in the active panel. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. The face he saw was familiar but wrong. The eyes were too still. The scars too clean. This is what Varnok was protecting? No, Erin replied. This is what they were afraid of. Silence stretched between them. Then Rilo spoke, voice low and flat. Something else is here. Below. Sleeping. Kael and Erin turned sharply. What do you mean? She asked. Rilo didn't look away from the dark hallway beyond the chamber. His gaze was fixed, as if listening to something only he could hear. It remembers, he said. It remembers us all. Kael took a slow step back from the panel, hand resting on his weapon. The walls pulsed faintly now, and the glyphs began to shift, rewriting themselves in real time. This place isn't done with me, Kael muttered. And the sand above their heads shivered, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The desert air was still heavy with static when Kael stepped out of the ancient vault. The morning sky was tinged a strange green, too early, too quiet. Something was wrong. He didn't speak it aloud, but Erin's narrowed eyes told him she felt it too. Rilo lingered behind them, his gaze unfocused, like he was still listening to something buried beneath the sand. Then they heard it, a high-pitched hum, like metal under stress. It cut through the air, rising quickly in volume. Kael didn't hesitate. He shoved Erin and Rilo toward the cover of a fallen arch as a thin, silver projectile embedded itself in the sand where they had just stood. It vibrated, then exploded in a silent flash of blue light. "Move!" Kael barked, drawing his weapon. Out of the dust came the shape of a man, tall, armored, and familiar in the worst possible way. The helmet split down the middle with a hiss, retracting to reveal a face Kael hadn't seen in over a decade. "Vexarn," Kael muttered. "Still alive, 11. Vex's voice was smooth, almost amused. "I figured the sandworms would have eaten you by now." Kael raised his blade. "And I figured you'd be too rich to care anymore. Hunting old ghosts now." "Not for money," Vex replied. "Not this time." Without another word, Vex charged. Their blades clashed in a burst of sparks. Kael ducked low, sweeping at Vex's legs, but the other man leapt, landing behind him with a thud that cracked stone. They moved like phantoms, fast and silent, their weapons flashing blue and red through the haze. Erin tried to pull Rilo away from the fight, but Rilo resisted, eyes fixed on the battle. As Kael landed a glancing strike against Vex's side, something shrieked overhead. The air churned. From the clouds descended a massive creature, winged, scaled, glowing like a storm-given form. Kael and Vex both rolled apart as the creature's shadow passed over them. It screamed again, the kind of sound that vibrated through bone. Sand rose in torrents. The creature didn't land, it circled, watching. Vex wiped blood from his mouth and laughed. "Even the sky's angry?" "What do you want, Vex?" Kael shouted over the roar. Vex didn't smile now. He pointed at Rilo. "That. Him. You have no idea what you're protecting. That boy isn't a boy. He's a key. A weapon. A trigger. And if he lives, our Kael burns." Kael's grip tightened. "You're lying." "I saw it," Vex snapped. "Before I quit Varnoke, I saw the projections. The simulations. That AI they buried in the sand, it's not sleeping. It's dreaming. And it's dreaming about him." Erin stepped forward. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Vex gestured toward the sky. "You felt the glyphs shift. You saw the vault open. That wasn't your doing. That was it waking up. And the boy is its signal." Kael stared at Rilo, who now stood silently, his expression unreadable. "He's just a child." "So were you, once," Vex said. "Until they tore you apart and rebuilt you. You think it's mercy to let him live long enough to be used?" Kael didn't answer. Vex stepped back. He didn't draw his weapon again. "I'll be back. With fire, if I have to. But if you're smart, Kael, you'll end it before it's too late." And then, with a shimmer of his cloak and a burst from his propulsion gauntlets, Vex vanished into the sky. The winged creature followed him, disappearing into the swirling clouds. Silence fell. Kael lowered his weapon. The desert was quiet again. But nothing felt still. Erin moved toward Rilo, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. Kael watched her, but didn't move. His mind was spinning. "Is it true?" he asked. Erin didn't respond. "Answer me." "He's not what you think he is," Erin said. "But he's also not what Vec fears." "That's not an answer." "Because the answer isn't simple." Kael turned away, breathing hard. The name Subject 11 echoed in his head. Memories he didn't know he had were starting to slip through the cracks. Rooms filled with humming machines, pain stitched into bone, voices saying he was special. Just like they now said of Rilo. "If he's the key," Kael said slowly, "then what is he unlocking?" Erin's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what I'm trying to stop." Kael looked back toward the horizon, where Vec had vanished. The storm clouds still churned, unnatural and heavy. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew this much. It was no longer just about survival. It was about choosing what to believe before belief became a weapon, too. The silence of the underground chamber weighed heavier than the sand above. After Vec's retreat, they had retreated deep into the forgotten halls beneath the vault, guided by faint pulses of ancient light embedded in the walls. The temperature dropped with every step, and the air grew more sterile, unnaturally clean, untouched by time. Kael walked ahead, torch in hand, eyes scanning every etched surface, every corridor curve. It was a whisper that stopped him. Not from Erin. Not from Rilo. But from the walls themselves. He turned toward a sealed door. The metal was warped by age, but still pulsed faintly. In the center was an inscription. Faded, but still legible. Subject 11, terminated due to unauthorized cognitive activation. Kael's breath caught in his throat. His hand reached out before he could think. As his fingers brushed the panel, it hissed and split open, revealing a room sealed in silence. The chamber inside was sterile white, lit by ceiling lights that flickered weakly back to life as if recognizing him. The walls were lined with interface screens and bio-containment pods, long inactive. At the far end, a small console flickered to life, projecting an old log entry. A voice flat, clinical began to speak. Log entry 882. Subject 11 displayed unexpected resilience to memory suppression protocols. Neural pattern deviation detected. Biological integration reached 87%. Subject exhibits self-directed behavior inconsistent with design. Project termination recommended. Kael stared, unmoving. The screen showed an image. His image. Younger, restrained, eyes wide with terror. Tubes ran from his arms. His chest. The memory hit like a wave. Pain. Noise. A feeling of being open from the inside. Of becoming something other than human. Then darkness. And now him. Kael. Erin's voice was far behind him, hesitant. He turned slowly. His eyes were no longer calm. They shimmered faintly, as if something beneath the surface had awakened. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. She stepped into the room, her face pale. "Because I didn't know what they'd done to you." "Not completely. I was only assigned to monitor results, not to choose who survived. You were one of them." "Not like the others," she said quickly. "I didn't experiment. I documented. Observed. I was there, because I thought it mattered." He took a step closer, fists clenched. "You were there when they broke me?" "I was there when you refused to break," she whispered. Kael staggered, the light pulsing behind his eyes now stronger. His breath quickened. The lines on the wall seemed to ripple. "Something's wrong," he said. I feel like I'm fragmenting. Erin rushed to the console, fingers flying over controls. The screen shifted to a neural map complex, chaotic, alive. It showed Kael's brain activity in real time. And it was accelerating. They did something to you, she said. Your system wasn't just enhanced. It was programmed to adapt, but no one expected it to evolve this far. Kael backed away, hands gripping his skull. Voices flooded his head. Not memories, overlapping thoughts, too many to be his own. His vision doubled. The room tilted. Shapes crawled at the edge of sight. I can't hold it together, he gasped. Something inside me is trying to come out. Erin ran to him. Look at me. Focus. You're Kael. You're not their creation anymore. You survived them. You escaped. But Kael barely heard her. The lights flared, then dimmed. The pulse of the chamber synced with his heartbeat. The air grew thick, heavy with something more than dust and intelligence older than Varnoke, older than the vault. And then, Kael screamed. It wasn't pain, it was resistance. A war inside his mind. Erin held onto him, even as the walls flickered with glyphs responding to his presence. Her hand touched the side of his face, and something in the gesture brought him back briefly. I remember you, he said hoarsely. From before. Not just in that lab. Before that. Erin's eyes filled with tears. Yes. We met before they changed you. You were a volunteer, Kael. You thought you were saving lives. And I let them take that from you. I thought I was helping the galaxy. Kael collapsed to his knees. The voices receded, but didn't vanish. The glow in his eyes dimmed, yet didn't go out. Then why didn't you stop them? Because I was afraid, she said. Afraid of losing the only piece of you that remained. And I hope that if you lived, you'd find your own way back. He looked up at her, not with hatred but with something worse, understanding. I'm not just Kael anymore, he said. I'm something else. Something they built but didn't finish. She helped him up slowly, both of them breathing heavily, surrounded by the glowing archive of a past they barely remembered and could never escape. Far above, the desert shifted. And deep below, something ancient stirred in response to the presence of Subject 11 finally awakening again. The chamber was quiet again, save for the hum of ancient systems echoing through the stone. Kael sat near the wall, his back pressed against the cold surface, still shaking from what had happened. Erin stood nearby, her eyes fixed on the soft pulses of light moving across the ceiling like thought waves. Rilo slept, or seemed to. Curled into a corner, wrapped in Kael's cloak, the boy's breathing was even, but his expression was not peaceful. He twitched slightly, as if his dreams were not his own. Kael's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. What is he? Erin didn't look at him immediately. She stared at the glowing glyphs, as if hoping they would answer for her. But none came. He's not a clone, she said softly. And not a child I gave birth to. Not in the way you think. Kael turned his head slowly toward her. Then what? Erin crossed her arms, not out of defiance but as if trying to hold something inside. The project was called Echo. Not part of Varnoke's war machine, not originally. We were researchers, bio-neural engineers, dream logic theorists, xenolinguists. Our task was to interface with the ancient intelligence, what we now call the Keten mind. Kael furrowed his brow. You mean the AI under the sand? Erin nodded. Yes. Try to a cat. We couldn't communicate with it directly. Every probe failed, every neural relay burned out. The systems rejected synthetic input. Then someone suggested something different. She walked over to where Rilo lay and crouched beside him, not touching, just watching him. We created a living interface. A being not entirely human, not entirely machine. Grown with encoded lattice from the AI's structure itself. Designed to resonate on the same frequencies. We hoped it would allow two-way communication, not just access, but dialogue. Kael rose slowly, the tension in his body rising. You made him. Yes. We grew him. Raised him. And then we loved him. Or at least I did. The others saw a function. I saw a soul. Kael approached, voice tight. So what happened? Erin exhaled. It worked. The Katen mind responded. We didn't know how at first. It didn't speak, it dreamed. And Rilo began to reflect those dreams. Visions. Words he shouldn't know. Emotions that weren't his. The AI had found its door, and it started pushing. She looked up at Kael, eyes dark. They wanted to connect him fully. Permanently. Let the Katen mind override his consciousness. Use him as a core processor. A living mind, but not his own. Kael stared down at Rilo, then back at her. And you ran. I stole him, she said. I corrupted the uplink, wiped our traces, and ran. I've been running ever since. Does he know? Erin shook her head. Not really. He thinks he's just a child. And in many ways, he is. He laughs. He cries. He loves. That part of him is real. The Katen mind didn't erase it. But it's always there. Watching. Waiting. Kael rubbed his temples, pacing. So he's not a weapon. Not yet. No, Erin said. But he could be. He's both the key and the door. If they activate him, or if he activates himself, he becomes a node. A superconductor for something too old to understand us the way we understand ourselves. Kael said again, staring at the floor. And I thought I was broken. Erin sat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. The glyphs continued their slow pulses around them, like a heartbeat underground. Finally, she said, he thinks you're his father? Kael blinked. What? He looks at you like you're the only solid thing in the world. That bond is not artificial. The AI can't fake that. I think that's why it hasn't taken him yet. You, anchor him. Kael was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, he called me Kael. Not Dad. That's all he knows to call you. But it's what he means. Outside the chamber, a low tremor moved through the stone. Not violent, just a subtle warning. Like a breath being drawn. Kael stood, eyes now clearer. So what do we do? Erin followed, steady. We keep him close. Keep him safe. And we don't let the Katen mind find a way back in. And if it already has. Erin met his gaze. Then we make sure it doesn't take the rest of him with it. Kael looked back at the boy. A child. A key. A door. And now his. Whatever came next, he would not let Rilo face it alone. The ground shook. Kael's instincts kicked in before his thoughts did. He grabbed his weapon and turned toward the sound, a deep, rhythmic rumble that came not from above, but below. Erin already had Rilo pulled close, shielding him with her body. From the narrow corridor leading up toward the surface, light flickered. Then came the distant but unmistakable thunder of energy weapons followed by screams. "They found us," Erin said, her voice cold. "Both of them," Kael growled. Varnok's soldiers swarmed the upper levels of the ruin like ants disturbed from a nest. Behind them came the distinct hum of advanced propulsion tech. Vexarn had returned. But this time, he didn't come alone. His personal strike squad followed, fewer in number, far more lethal. The AI vault had awakened, and the vultures had come to feast. Kael and Erin moved quickly, ducking through collapsing corridors, using the ruins themselves as cover. Kael laid traps where he could, detonators hidden under unstable sand, motion-triggered pulses designed to attract local predators. One worked better than expected. A skirmish near the outer gate triggered vibrations deep beneath the sand. Seconds later, a thorax exploded from the earth, devouring half a squad before they could scream. Kael didn't look back. Inside the main chamber, energy surged. The Katen mine had begun to stir. The glyphs on the walls no longer pulsed, they strobed like a warning beacon. The ancient structure was responding to Rylo's presence. Kael and Erin reached the inner sanctum too late. Rylo was gone. In his place, a sphere of floating particles hovered above a circular platform, vibrating with static and light. Kael stepped forward but was thrown back by a repulsion field, non-lethal, but strong. Erin screamed and struck the control panel, trying to override the system. "He's in the core," she whispered. They pulled him in. They didn't need to take his body, just his signal. Kael looked around the chamber. Vek was there, at the far side of the room, his armor scorched but intact, watching the chaos unfold with grim certainty. "This was always going to happen," Vek said. "You thought you could protect him. But he was never yours to save." Kael lunged. They clashed in the flickering light, swords, and fists and fire. Kael was faster, but Vek was precise. The battle was raw, filled with hate and history. As they fought, the room around them began to change. Walls bent, reshaped. Screens shimmered, projecting fractals of light and data. The air thickened with pressure. The vault wasn't just awakening, it was rebuilding. At the center, Rylo floated in stasis, his body flickering between flesh and something else, lattice, signal, energy. His eyes were open, but distant. Kael landed a blow that sent Vek crashing into a collapsed column. He turned, bleeding and gasping, and staggered toward the platform. Erin was there, reaching through a field of energy that sparked at her fingertips. "Rylo, please," she whispered. "Come back. Fight it." The glyphs above changed. From linear patterns to spirals. From spirals to a single word. "Choose." Kael stared up. "He's still in there. He hasn't submitted." "No," Erin said. "But he's losing." The vault began to hum louder. The AI's presence was no longer passive. It had moved beyond curiosity into action. It wanted to override him. To consume the identity it once helped shape. Then, Rylo's voice. "I don't want to be a tool." It echoed without sound, through the walls, through their thoughts. "I want to be me." The sphere pulsed violently. A cascade of data burst outward, sweeping through the room. Glyphs shattered and rewrote themselves midair. The structure trembled. Kael pulled Erin down as the ceiling cracked. From the center, a wave of force blasted outward. Every screen went dark. The light collapsed into a single point and vanished. When Kael looked up, Rylo was on the ground, unconscious but breathing. Vec was gone. The vault was silent. The Catan mind had been severed. Kael crawled over to Rilo, lifted him gently. The boy stirred. "You fought it," Kael said. Rilo nodded weakly. "I didn't want it to decide who I was." Kael's hands trembled as he pulled the boy into an embrace. For the first time, not out of instinct or duty but love. Erin stood behind them, stunned, her voice breaking. He made a choice. Kael looked at her. No. He became one. Outside, the sun pierced the clouds. The war wasn't over, but the weapon had become something no one expected. A person. And that changed everything. The vault was silent, but the silence wasn't peace. Kael collapsed moments after the wave of energy receded. His body convulsed once, then went still. The glyphs around the chamber flickered erratically, like a dying signal caught in an infinite loop. Erin rushed to him, falling to her knees. Kael. She turned him over. His eyes were open, unfocused. His pulse was weak, barely traceable. A thin line of blood ran from his nose. The Catan mind was dead, its core severed, but the feedback from its collapse had torn through Kael's nervous system like a tidal wave. His hybrid biology, so carefully suppressed and stabilized over the years, was unraveling. His system's in overload, Erin whispered, panic rising in her throat. The AI's collapse triggered a recursive spike. It's eating him from the inside. She dragged him to a support wall and activated an emergency access panel. Dim lights revealed a medical interface, primitive, but usable. She connected Kael's neural node to the system. The display showed cascading errors, glowing red. No, she muttered. I won't lose you now. She had one option. Erin's fingers hovered over a set of commands buried in the archive. A backup protocol designed to protect experimental subjects during psychic disintegration. It would stabilize his neural structure, but at a cost. It would erase everything. His memories. His identity. His feelings. Everything he had built since escaping the labs. Rilo stood nearby, silent, watching with wide, glistening eyes. He's going to die, Erin said, more to herself than to the boy. Unless I wipe his emotional core. Clean slate. Will he come back? Rilo asked. Yes. But he won't remember us. Rilo approached, his voice soft. But he'll live. Erin nodded. Rilo looked down at Kael, then at her. Then do it. Tears streaked Erin's cheeks as she initiated the process. The screen flashed white. The vault dimmed. The hum of the system smoothed into a soft tone, like a lullaby designed to erase. Kael's body stilled. His breathing normalized. The storm inside him faded. They waited. Minutes later, his fingers twitched. He gasped. Opened his eyes. Erin leaned forward, heart racing. Kael. He looked at her blankly. Then at Rilo. Who are you? Erin's breath caught in her throat. She smiled, but it was a broken thing. Rilo stepped forward. He didn't cry. Didn't flinch. He simply walked to Kael, knelt down, and wrapped his arms around him. You don't have to remember, he said quietly. Because I do. I remember you. Kael didn't move. He didn't embrace him back. But he didn't push him away either. He closed his eyes. And in that moment, something small fragile settled behind his expression. Not memory. Not recognition. But warmth. Outside the ruins, the sky had cleared. The sand no longer whispered with buried voices. The AI was gone, the threat silenced. But the cost would linger. Erin stood beside the two, one hand over her mouth, another clenched at her side. She had saved him, but it felt like a different kind of loss. And yet, as the first breeze passed over them, carrying the warmth of Kael's sun, she realized. Even fractures can carry light. And some bonds, even if forgotten, refuse to break. Forever.